I'm delighted to be here.
Amen.
It's always good to be back in London. Fond memories, way back. So, after what we've heard, I think somebody asked why the data that we just saw, and most importantly, what do we do about that? So did you know, before today that is, did you know that for every 7 young Christians in the UK who side with the Palestinians, there are only 4 who support Israel? Did you know that? You probably didn't. That's 1.75 to 1. That's the ratio. Now that's pretty close to 2 to 1. And the other question would be, are we aware that should this trend continue, the ratio will actually, before too long, be 2 to 1. In other words, twice as many young people siding with the Palestinians than those young people siding with Israel and the Jewish people. How did we get here? And what can we do about that? Okay, let me preface, before I try to answer those questions, let me preface my talk with 3 important caveats. First, our focus will be young Christians ages 18 and 29, 18 through to 29, usually called emerging adults. And why is that? Because this segment of our survey displays trends that deviate from what we have come to expect from older generations. They are also the demographic, as we've just heard, where the dwindling commitment to Israel is most evident. Second caveat, Israel should be taken in a general sense as referring to the Jewish people and Israel, not simply the citizens of the state of Israel. Because in Israel today, there are 7.7 million Jews. That's 77% of the population, of the total population of 10 million. But there is a slightly higher number of Jews who are not Israeli citizens and live in other parts of the world, in the diaspora. In a sense, in a very real sense, they are also Israel, but not part of the nation state. And we must keep in mind today that the Jewish question, of times almost forgotten, has become now the Israel question. So it still has to do with Jews. So we're talking about Israel and the Jewish people. And finally, we are confining our analysis to the global north, that is basically Western countries. Arguably, support for Israel among Christians in the global south is much stronger than in Western countries for several reasons, but we will not concern ourselves with that today. Let me give you an ultra-short answer to each of the first 3 questions so that you know where we are going. Why is Christian support for Israel waning, declining among those aged 18 to 29? Because their sources of morality have changed. Why is Christian support for Israel waning? Because Israel has been politicized. And thirdly, why is Christian support for Israel waning in the global north? Because Western secular society and morality is an anomaly in the grand scheme of human morality. Let me unpack this. There is an author, Jonathan Rinhold, who back in 2021 asked this question: will evangelical support for Israel wane? And then he rightly pointed out the following: the main target of anti-Zionist evangelicals is the younger generation. Indeed, it has been claimed that support for Israel is beginning to wane among this cohort, and that over time this could lead to a reversal of fortunes. And latest surveys have shown this to be the case, not only in the US, but also in other countries. And we have just heard about the situation here in the UK. So, what does the data tell us? I'm going to point out just a couple of things. 44.1% of young Christians, remember we are talking about ages 18 to 29, 44.1% of them claim that the Bible is the highest authority for their beliefs, while at the same time, 42.8% attend church services at least once every week. But only 19.1% of them think that the Jews are still God's chosen people, and 45.2% believe in the ongoing character of God's covenant with the Jewish people. When asked in the survey if they hear other members of their congregations, of their communities, talk about the importance of supporting Israel, 62.4% say that they never or seldom do. And also, as a side note, we don't have time for that, 83% of young Christians do not hold to a premillennial eschatology. But what I find particularly alarming is the fact that 53.3% of UK Christians under the age of 30 agree that Israel has committed genocide in Gaza. And 45.6% are convinced that Israel deliberately targets Palestinian civilians. Now, these two responses are widespread anti-Zionist claims that derive from old anti-Semitic tropes. So the general picture we are left with is 33.4% of young Christians lean towards support or very strongly support Palestinians, and only 19% do the same in the case of Israel. This is what I was referring to at the beginning of my talk, almost 2 to 1. Perhaps one of the most puzzling things from an evangelical point of view is that almost half of the respondents, ages 18 to 29, admit that their religious beliefs do not have any bearing on how they view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How can that be? There is an apparent discrepancy between their high regard for Scripture and frequent church involvement, on the one hand, and on the other, their stereotypical views of Jews and sympathetic opinions about Israel. According to Imbari and Waning, in their latest book, the leading social and demographic factors that help us predict the Christian level of support for Israel are age, religious commitment, interpreted in this particular case as church attendance, regular contact with like-minded people, that's what we call socialization, either pro or anti-Israel, and political ideology. On the right, as for the purely biblical and theological factors, the most relevant ones, according to them, are the eschatological view, the perspective on supersessionism, and church affiliation. Now, looking at some of the highlights of the latest study that we've just heard of, social factors appear to weigh more than religious ones. Why is that? Well, let's see some possible explanations. Back in 1963, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel warned, an Orthodox Jew, by the way, warned about two great perils Protestant churches faced from a Jewish perspective. In his view, these were the two that appear on the screen. First of all, the de-Judaization of Christianity, which led to a radical break with its Jewish roots, including the Hebrew scriptures. And secondly, the desanctification of the Bible. That is, and I think this is very important and insightful, the unwillingness to sit under the authority of the Bible and find, in his words, I'm quoting him, the presence of God in the Bible. Later, in 1976, another author, H.L. Ellison, wrote this: "The existence of the State of Israel, the suffering it has meant for many Palestinian Arabs, and the whole state of uncertainty that has existed in the Middle East for over 25 years, remember we're talking about 1976, have made many Christians think of the position of the Jews in God's plans and purposes largely in political terms." And more recently, in 2021, Carrie Nelson said this, and he was spot on: "Reliance on theological categories and theological debate has gradually given way to political debate in many Protestant denominations." I think it is safe to say that we have increasingly de-biblicized and de-theologized Israel and the Jewish people. In other words, we have secularized and politicized the whole question of the Jewish people, the Jews. In other words, we have taken Israel and the Jewish people out of the biblical framework and the theological discussion. Israel has become a talking point for politicians and political pundits, and increasingly less so for Christians interpreting the Bible and doing theology. We hear a lot of Israel, about Israel, in the news, but precious little from the pulpit. I'm afraid a new secular trinity is ruling the Western world. There you have it. Human rights, social justice, and international law. And many people make moral decisions once the whole issue has been taken out of the Bible and it's become a moral thing, a political thing. Many people make moral decisions based on these. So this has become our particular spirit of the age. The process of secularization has created a new kind of morality, particularly in Western countries, which quite often is at odds with other traditional Christian values. So remember we are talking about the why, before we tackle the how-to, try to fix this. So let me introduce you briefly, because we are going to use this particular theory as our lens to look at the problem. In an effort to understand how human morality works, American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues developed what's called the moral foundations theory about 20 years ago. So according to this theory, when faced with a situation that requires us to make a moral judgment on something, moral intuitions, in other words, gut feelings, come first. We'd like to think of ourselves as very rational people, making rational decisions, but the first thing that comes to us is the instinct, right? So after that, our mind makes a case for what we have already decided. And that's what we call the confirmation bias. So I'm looking for information that will confirm that I was right from the very beginning. So secondly, not everyone has the same intuitions. These vary from person to person and from group or culture to another group or culture. And the strongest predictors of our moral decisions are ideology, age, gender, and religiosity. Our intuitions, says this theory, are based on a relatively limited number of moral foundations. So 6 are found across cultures all over the world, even in our secular Western world. So these 6 foundations shape our intuitions. And these are, I'm simplifying a bit here, care for the hurting, from left to right, care for the hurting, liberty from all forms of oppression, justice for all, in-group loyalty, respect for authority, and the sanctity of certain ideals. The thing is that the relative importance given to each one of these moral foundations varies considerably. And how we combine those particular foundations predicts the moral group that we will more closely identify with, along a spectrum, as you can see, that goes all the way from one extreme to the other, and so on and so forth. So the 3 first moral foundations of care, liberty, and justice focus on the individual, focus or center around the personal well-being of people, their rights. Since the age of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, these have become the hallmark of progressives. And please bear with me, because this is important to understand what we're going to see in just a moment. Now, on the other hand, the other 3, loyalty, respect, and sanctity, focus on group cohesion and social stability. Conservative people value very much these foundations, without forgetting the others that we have already considered. Question for you. Which one of these 2 moral universes do you think best describes our society? Is it the one on the left with only basically 3 moral foundations, care, liberty, and justice? Or is it the one on the right with all 6 moral foundations? It's really a rhetorical question. We know that our society is that one on the left. The reality is that we have a weird morality. I'm not calling you names, I promise. WEIRD is an acronym, which means Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. So we fit the bill. Huh? We are a weird country. Europe is a weird country as far as morality is concerned. So these kinds of societies tend to operate with only three moral foundations: care, liberty, and justice. However, we are not the center of the world. And in many parts of the world, particularly the global south, more traditional societies share all six moral foundations, not just these three that I've pointed out. Now, to be fair, the real picture is closer to this. So we find pockets of traditional morality in weird societies, and we do also occasionally find weird moralities in more traditional societies. For example, we Christians in the West are one of these pockets over there. We are a minority as far as morality is concerned. A minority who lives in the middle of a vast ocean of weird morality. So, according to moral foundations theory, and that's where we want to go, there is a progressive moral matrix and a conservative moral matrix. So the first one, the progressives, the moral matrix holds caring for the victims as the overarching value. Next comes freedom, liberty, from all forms of oppression, and being treated fairly, justice. And the binding foundations, well, they are considered almost non-existent. I mean, who cares nowadays for loyalty to the social group one belongs to, for respect for authority and tradition, and abiding by the idea that certain things are considered sacred? For many progressives, these other foundations play a marginal role or none at all. Now, conversely, the conservative moral matrix would hold the preservation of the institutions and traditions that sustain a given moral community as the overarching value. And all six of these are given about the same importance in order to achieve the common goal. So we have a different matrix. We have an individualizing kind of matrix, the first one, and a more binding is called moral matrix. And Jonathan Haidt says, and this is very interesting, that once a group is bound together by shared values, such as tolerance and diversity, and shared demons, for instance, racism, people in the group find it hard to perceive or accept empirical findings that contradict their shared moral matrix. And this is why groups on opposite sides of a conflict, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, tend to become epistemic bubbles, or, that's at best, or echo chambers at worst. In other words, people just stick to what they've decided they are going to believe. Now, please note that I'm not endorsing in any way this particular theory. I'm just using it to interpret the data and why support for Israel is declining, okay? So, actually, this shows that there are two souls within Christianity. Much like their non-Christian counterparts, progressive Christians score high on the individualizing foundations: care, liberty, and justice. Whereas conservative Christians, in line with other conservative groups within our society, score about the same on individualizing and binding foundations, that is, loyalty, respect, and sanctity. Now, let me show you how all this applies to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We could talk about an anti-Israel moral matrix, okay? So why do so many young Christians have a less than positive view on Israel and the Jewish people? Because they could fit perfectly well into this particular moral matrix. So the main concern, from left to right, the main concern is to care for the victims of occupation and oppression. So compassion for the victims is paramount, followed closely by freedom, resisting all forms of oppression, the second column, and the pursuit of justice and rights for all. Nothing else seems to matter. On the other hand, the pro-Israel moral matrix, as you can see, just about everything matters. Okay, the overarching concern for this moral matrix that we're talking about is, unlike the other one, to preserve a secure national home for the Jewish people. Now, compassion for the victims and true freedom and justice for all those involved in the conflict are vital. They sure are. But so is the recognition of the Jewish legitimacy, their law and traditions, and the holiness of the land. So the big question is, where do we get our moral intuitions from? It used to be the case, not so long ago, that both individualizing and binding moral foundations were reinforced, all of them were reinforced by the teaching of Scripture, Revelation, the values we learned at home, our upbringing, and even what we read and heard from the media, from traditional media, talking about newspapers, remember those paper things? And TV, just 1-2 channels perhaps. That used to be the case. Today, however, the sources of morality, and in particular for this age cohort that we're talking about, have changed. Today, the influence of the Bible, family, and traditional media is rapidly declining. Instead, liberal universities and institutions of higher learning, peer pressure, and social media, of course, reinforce not all 6 moral foundations, just 3 of them: care, liberty, and justice, to the detriment of the others: loyalty, respect, and sanctity. And this is what we see around us. So that explains, at least partly, the question: why young Christians, are more religious, but at the same time more anti-Semitic? How can that be? Well, that can be because there is a disconnect between beliefs, their religious belief and practice, and moral political issues. How can that be? Well, that can be because there is an inability, because of the moral foundations they operate on, to appreciate the arguments of the other side. Moral foundations, you see, bind like-minded people, but also blind those people when they come into contact with others who hold a different morality. So, people who look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict only through the moral lens of caring for the victims, securing freedom for the oppressed, and pursuing justice and rights for all, find it easy to justify their animosity towards Israel on moral grounds, especially when all they hear about is a one-sided narrative. Alternatively, those who also take into account the moral lens of remaining loyal to the call of the Jewish people, respecting their history and traditions, and acknowledging the sacredness of their lives and their land, can more readily empathize or sympathize with Israel on both moral and spiritual grounds. So, as we approach the end, what are some possible solutions? We've seen the why. Now, what can we do about that? We know what doesn't work. Election, covenant, and eschatology are prominent, binding biblical foundations. Not individualizing, binding. They have to do with loyalty, respect, and sanctity, basically. So our mid and long-term goal is to gradually help them use all 6 moral foundations, not just care, liberty, and justice. I mean, in the West, we tend to think that all that matters is that. And of course, if you apply that lens, you will see Israel as a terrible aggressor, oppressor, and all the rest of it. But that's not the truth. If you apply all moral foundations, you will see Israel under a very different light. Very different indeed. So election, covenant, and eschatology doesn't work. So, call to action number 1, and I'm finishing with this. Call to action number 1, fight, what can we do? Fight replacement theology. Fight supersessionism. In other words, that's the academic term, but it's basically the same. We have a problem with supersessionism. In fact, we have a problem with crypto-supersessionism. In other words, a hidden or a latent form of supersessionism. That supersessionism that we don't think it's there, but it is there. In many quarters, Christians pay lip service to the Old Testament, but they invalidate it because it's not good enough, or at least not as good as the New Testament. Something very easy to remember if the slide works. Okay. The 3 R's of supersessionism, or replacement theology, if you like. Think of this and you'll understand what supersessionism is. Ultimately, it's the obliteration of the Jewish people. And it comes in the form of a process. So, first, the Jews are no longer rewarded. They lose their chosenness. Then the Jews are no longer required and lose their divine-given mission. Finally, the Jews are no longer remembered and lose their identity. What one author has called Israel forgetfulness. Second call to action. Help young Christians in your churches travel to Israel and learn firsthand what it is like to be living there. as opposed to socializing with Jews in the West, go there. Traveling to Israel, attending key lectures, meeting with locals, listening to their testimonies can go a long way towards helping young people understand what it means to live there. Less than a month ago, the Jerusalem Post published an opinion piece called, believe it or not, "The Clear and Urgent Need for Evangelical Trips to Israel." That's a Jewish rabbi writing in an Israeli newspaper. And what he aims in this opinion piece is, let's take young people, evangelical people from America, he says, I would say from all other weird countries, and let's bring 10,000 young evangelicals to Israel by 2026. It's amazing. I mean, Israelis have clearly understood what we sometimes just don't get. I'm quoting, "Some younger evangelicals shaped by cultural and academic environments are increasingly critical of Israel. And by launching Birthright for evangelicals, Israel could inspire a new generations, create enduring partnerships, and ensure that the flame of evangelical support for Israel continues to burn brightly." So we need the vision and the funding to enable our young people, Christians, and particularly evangelical Christians, to participate in similar projects. And call to action number 3, organize study groups in your church. International initiatives are all good and well, but we need a lot of work at the grassroots level. Local churches are instrumental in our development of Christian believers, as Christian believers. But Sunday services are not enough. Feeding our emotions is not enough. We need study groups where people can learn, pray, and act. Let them study the Bible, but also, alongside that, relevant documents and position papers on pertinent issues like supersessionism, Christian Zionism, Palestinian liberation theology, or anti-Semitism. We need to engage critically in what is happening around us. In conclusion, as we now return to our homes, workplaces, churches, let's share what's in our minds and hearts with those who cannot see beyond their particular moral matrix. There is a lot of work ahead of us, but it is well worth the effort. And as we do, let's remember what 2 wise Jewish men said. The first one was talking about supersessionism and said this: "A world without Israel will be a world without the God of Israel." The other one, equally wise, addressed a very distinguished audience and opened his speech talking about anti-Semitism, saying, "The hate that begins with Jews never ends with Jews." We have been warned. Christians are next. We cannot say we didn't know. So may we listen to this clarion call and pass on such wisdom to the future generations. Thank you very much.